Welcome back. What can we know of Jesus from a historical perspective? Biblical scholar Dominic Crossan collaborated with the pastor, Richard G. Watts, to write a book called Who is Jesus? The book explores the life, work, and message of the man from Galilee. Now, Dr. Shabir, you'll be dialoguing with Dominic Crossan in April. So I guess this is a good reason for us to look at one of his books, and the book we've chosen, Who is Jesus? I guess my first question is, why didn't he say, who is Jesus Christ?
Well, he does believe that Jesus is the Christ, but I think he's used the title to make it as short as possible so that it can be catchy and easily researched and found. The book itself is meant to be for a popular readership, and it's almost a condensed version, a much simplified version of his earlier book, Jesus, A Revolutionary Biography.
Mm-hmm. So who is the historical Jesus then, and how can we find out who he is?
Actually, now the way in which you've put this makes me realize that my previous answer was inadequate, because from a historical point of view, one wouldn't say that Jesus was the Christ, because to say that he was the Christ is a religious, is a theological sort of affirmation. And so from a strictly historical point of view, we would be interested in knowing the man who actually lived and walked in Palestine and had the name Jesus. So the book shows that when we read the Gospels, we are to be aware that the Gospels are theological constructs on the life and teachings of Jesus. The Gospel writers had certain ideas which they wanted to convey, and then they used the incidents from the life of Jesus to convey those ideas. So when we read the Gospels, we have to be aware of the two levels of inquiry here. Theologically, what are the Gospels saying? And historically, what were the incidents that lay behind this depiction of Jesus?
Mm-hmm. And there's also mention of the fact that there are many, many Gospels available, and that the Gospel writers drew from all those Gospels as well.
More so that there were many narratives, many shorter stories about Jesus circulating at the time. And when the Gospel writers set out to do their work, they had to be selective. They couldn't write down all of the stories, because obviously they're writing on parchments or on scrolls of limited length and size. And so they have to be selective for that reason. But they're also selective because they have particular ideas that they want to convey, and so they're looking for material that will convey those ideas. So Mark, for example, puts all the miracles of Jesus in one place. So naturally he has an idea, I'm leading now to deal with the miracles, and I'm going to collect all of the miracle stories, put them in this sequence. So the Gospel writers were selective, writing down the stories that they were exposed to, but specifically those stories that they were interested in recording for bringing out the points of view that they wanted to share about Jesus.
Mm-hmm. So then how would we go about finding out who Jesus is with historical accuracy then?
Well,
if we can't rely on these Gospels.
One of the tools that the historians use, as explained by Dr. Crossan, is they read across the Gospels as opposed to reading the Gospels just from beginning to end. See, normally a reader opens the Bible, comes to the New Testament, first Gospel is the Gospel according to Matthew. You start at the beginning of Matthew, you read all the way to the end of Matthew, then you go to the next Gospel, which is Mark. You start at the beginning, you read to the end. But what historians do is they put the four Gospels in parallel columns, and they read across the Gospel so that they see that there is the one little episode in the life of Jesus. Jesus, for example, came to Capernaum and he preached. Well, what did he say? We go to one Gospel, what did he say there? And the second Gospel, what did he say there? And the third Gospel, what did he say? So we're looking at the same speech on the same occasion, and we're asking, why do the words vary from one Gospel to another? And what were the original words that Jesus actually said in order for it to be recorded in these three different Gospels, or sometimes four different Gospels in different ways?
Mm-hmm. Now, there are many claims that Dominic Crossan makes. Is anything new that he says in this book, or how would Christians view his book?
Generally, he would come across as an ultra-liberal scholar, being a historian and at the same time a Christian.
Because he questions things like the miracles, he questions the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, things like that. So I wonder how his book would be received.
Yes, in many of the presentations within his book, though he is of course questioning some traditional types of Christian affirmations, he is giving a sort of different interpretation of traditional affirmations. So for example, with the stories of Jesus healing people, he differentiates between the cure of a disease and the healing of an individual. He says that a person having a disease also needs to be cured as an individual. What he's saying is that the person has also a kind of a mental stress from being under this disease or suffering from the disease. The person is suffering from a physical disease, to be sure, and also sometimes from alienation, especially in those times, alienation from the society in which he lives.
So there's a psychological aspect to it as well.
So there's a psychological aspect. And what Jesus was doing, according to John Dominic Crossan, was not so much curing the disease, but healing the individual by bringing that individual into the society and letting that individual feel as part of that society as being welcome as anybody else. Whereas, in contradistinction to this, some of the laws that were prevalent at the time, especially in those religious circles, sort of excommunicated people who had certain diseases. Maybe this was a kind of a preservation technique of isolating the sick person so that other people do not get sick as a result or contaminated with the illness of that person. But Jesus, on the other hand, according to Crossan, was bringing people into the society, and so he was curing, not curing the disease, but healing the individuals.
Mm-hmm. I found this aspect that Crossan mentions very, very fascinating, because we read stories about Jesus, but we don't really think of him as somebody who fought for justice or who cared about justice so much that he was interested in changing the social order. And Crossan talks a lot about that. Can you give us a little bit more detail on what he says?
Yes, according to Crossan, one of the chief principles of Jesus' whole program was what he refers to as open commensality, eating together in open society, opening the dining table to all and sundry. Whereas in the religious circles of his time, people were differentiating between Jew and Gentile and between clean and unclean. And they would only welcome to their table other people who had the same religious affiliations with them, with the expectation that they shared all of the kinds of dietary restrictions and so on that they had. And to them it was quite taboo to have, like, let's say, a Gentile come dine at the same table with a Jew, not observing the Jewish rights and regulations. And Jesus, according to Crossan, was now throwing out these traditional expectations and instead surprising people by welcoming at the same table men and women together, Jew and Gentile together.
Mm-hmm. So this was something that was very new and different, and I guess challenging to the authorities at the time.
Yes, this is where I find Crossan's exposition of the program of Jesus to be a little bit weak, because it seems that he builds on some true observations, but he builds too much, because we have to get to the point where, as even he admits, the Roman authorities would have felt challenged by Jesus to the extent that they want to kill him. They want to execute him publicly as a terrorist of the day, somebody committing treason, somebody wanting to overthrow the Roman rule. So how was Jesus doing this? Jesus, according to Crossan, was by practicing this open commensality, he was breaking down the barriers that kept everyone in their place. He was showing that we can have like a revolutionary...
He's changing the social order.
Exactly, changing the social order, and this was somehow thought to be a threat to the highest order, that is the Roman rule of the day. To me, it's a little bit stretched at that point, but it's interesting to see Crossan tease it out the way that he does.
So why should Muslims be interested in a book like this?
Well, naturally, Muslims would not agree with everything that's in a book like this, because Muslims have a particular theological position. This is a historical work that does not subscribe to any particular theological position of Muslims. But the Muslim theological belief should rest on a bedrock of history. So it's interesting and useful for Muslims to read a book on the history of Jesus, to know what is that historical bedrock, so that what they think about Jesus in a religious sense does not contradict what is that known history, that historical foundation.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you, Dr. Shabir Ali.
You're welcome.
We'll take a break, and when we return, we will answer questions we've received from you, our viewers.